Greetings to you all, and thank you for joining us while I reflect on applying cross-cultural theory and research for social good. I'd like to apologize. I am still recovering from COVID. I don't have my real voice, and I'm not at the top of my game, but let's see how we go. All right. We're frequently told that psychology in its cross-cultural, cultural, and indigenous forms can and should be applied to addressing pressing social problems. This is what leaders in our field have been telling us for quite a long time. But I would say psychology lags behind other social sciences in making significant social, economic, and political impact. And indeed, John Dovidio and Vicky Esses, the former editors of Social Issues and Policy Review, argued that psychologists are less likely to appear in the media, to influence public opinion, and to act as consultants for public policy. Now, I have been an advocate of applying cross-cultural theory and research, and these issues have been in the forefront of my mind. When, with colleagues, with the support of my colleagues, we established the Center for Applied Cross-Cultural Research at Victoria University of Wellington. I think we've had a reasonably successful history of working towards psychological and social positive outcomes in these domains, both with government and with community groups. But lately, I've been thinking about this issue of applying our knowledge and skills for social good. And one of the things that has prompted me to think more about this has been recent activities within IACCP, as we struggled to find positive ways forward to deal with, react to, or support victims of the war in the Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were not able to agree upon an initiative, a tangible initiative that might assist those who have been deeply affected by this horrible war. But even more fundamentally, and I say this with hesitation and regret, even more fundamentally, I found that across our membership, despite all of our knowledge and skills, our capacity to engage in constructive intercultural dialogue was severely limited. And I found this really depressing. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to reflect on the contribution cross-cultural psychology might be able to make to enhance positive outcomes for individuals and groups. In doing this, I'll talk a little bit about the enablers and the inhibitors. I will discuss important issues if we want to bridge the divide and apply our knowledge to alleviating social problems. And in particular, the production of programmatic research that is conducted in the real world, grounded in theory and communicated beyond our peers. And then at the end, I hope to give you just 3 examples of what this might look like, or pathways to making impact in the real world. Now, in principle, cross-cultural psychology should be very well placed to make these contributions to apply our theory and research. Why? Well, because we essentially examine human behavior and experience in context. And our analyses and our perspectives operate on multiple levels. We have our ecocultural framework, where we look at how ecological and socio-political contexts at the population level affects individual outcomes or psychological outcomes at the individual level. And because social problems, think of things like social deprivation or racism, operate on multiple levels: the micro individual, the meso situational, the macro societal levels. Cross-cultural psychology in principle should be well placed, particularly if we add to the cross-cultural perspective the cultural specific insights that are provided to us from cultural and indigenous approaches. But in principle is one thing, and in practice is quite another. And what we find is that there are a number of factors that inhibit us from conducting and applying psychological research. One is that it's unrewarded in our universities, at least our universities in Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic societies. So in the weird countries, universities favor basic research and rapid publication. Get it out there, get it out there, get it out there. But the reality is, if you're going to do applied research, it's very time consuming. You have to get out into the field. You have to establish and maintain networks, be it in government or be it in communities. This takes a lot of energy. This takes a lot of time. And on top of all that, there are very few of us who are really good at translating our research findings in ways that it is understandable and useful to information consumers. What do? We use a lot of jargon. Psychology theory is messy, it's complex. And if we're asked the why and the how, typically our response is, well, it depends. Well, when we pepper the "it depends" with a large amount of psychological jargon, it's not surprising that information consumers find us fairly unconvincing. So we don't do the best that we could in terms of being able to show in plain language why our research findings are important and indeed can be useful. So how do we bridge this divide? Here I draw from writings by John Dovidio and Vicky Esses, as I mentioned, the former editors of Social Issues and Policy Review. And they argue that for psychological research to be valuable in terms of addressing real world social problems, you need four things. So you have to have programmatic research. It needs to be conducted in the real world, grounded in theory, and communicated beyond our peers. So let's look at this in more detail. Programmatic research. Here we're talking about research that has an overarching theme, interrelated multi-method studies, and that's supported by coherent theory. So basically, multifaceted, multi-method, and in many cases, multidisciplinary research provides us with a strong base for translational science. Now, not all of us have the opportunity to work in big research teams. It's easier to do programmatic research if you're in big interdisciplinary teams, but it's not impossible for individuals to also achieve very profound and highly applied programs of research. And so what I'd like to do here is give us three examples, drawing across our psychologies. The cross-cultural, looking at Diener's work on subjective well-being, cultural psychology, drawing on Robert Serpol's work on cognition and education in Africa, and indigenous psychology, and someone we in our association may be less familiar with, work by Maria Yellow-Horse Braveheart on historical trauma. So let's look at these in turn. Okay, Diener's work. Diener has decades of research on happiness and social and subjective well-being. He has argued that we should have, in fact, national indices of happiness and well-being, and that we need to move our countries beyond just economic and political concerns in policymaking to include psychological ones. Now, many countries indeed now do, in fact, collect national data on well-being, including life satisfaction, as you can see in the graph here. These are data largely from the OECD, also partner countries, and you can see those that are very high in life satisfaction, like Colombia and Finland, and on the low end, we've got Turkey and South Korea. But even on that lower end, if you look at the 0 to 10 scale, you see that by and large, across these countries, people have moderate to high levels of life satisfaction. Now, Diener has argued that these data are very important because they can help us monitor our progress in terms of enhancing well-being across years, that these data can inform policy design, and also that they can be used for policy appraisal, like introduce new policies and see how well-being varies before and after the introduction of those policies. The point is, through his decades of research, it has been demonstrated that beyond the intrinsic value of life satisfaction, if you compare those who are low versus high in subjective well-being, we know those who are high have stronger immune systems, they live longer, they have lower levels of burnout, they're more pro-social and other-centered, they have better social relationships, and they are more productive in economic contributions to society. So what we can see just from those findings, and that's just a little tidbit of what Diener and colleagues have produced over the ages, we can clearly see that in terms of health outcomes, social outcomes, and economic outcomes, well-being is an important consideration. Now, if we move from an example of cross-cultural work to cultural psychology, and here I draw on research by Robert Serpell, who spent 25 years or so studying child development in Africa and its implications for formal education. Now, Serpell combined two threads of research. He was interested in children's practical intelligence and their skills acquisition, so adopting a perspective, a cultural perspective on child development. And with this, he combined research on adults' views and conceptualizations of child development, and in particular, intelligence. And in bringing these two threads together, he used multi-methods. He did quasi-experimental research. He did cross-cultural comparisons on children's perceptual and cognitive skills. He conducted ethnographic studies of adults' views and expectations about intelligence. And in bringing all of this together, he could see a disconnect between the indigenous perspectives on intelligence and child development and the formal educational system in Zambia, which relied on different sets of assumptions. So in an attempt to sort of reconcile or bridge the gap between the indigenous perspectives and formal education, essentially, he developed and evaluated a child-to-child program, which was designed to promote social responsibility in children. Social responsibility being a key component of Zambian conceptualizations of intelligence. And what he found in the evaluation is that those children who completed the child-to-child program were better prepared for the challenges of life in the rural villages, and also that parents were very positive about the outcomes because of the promotion of this indigenous value of social responsibility. Now, a third example I'd like to draw on is that research by Braveheart on historical trauma. She defines historical trauma as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. Her work originated with the Lakota Native peoples of North America. But the notion of historical trauma is broadly applicable to colonized indigenous people across the globe. The symptoms of historical trauma include depression, self-destructive behaviors, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, anger, even substance abuse. That her interests very much are in dealing with and recovering from historical trauma. And to those ends, she has developed and evaluated certain interventions. As you can see on the slide, she makes the point that you have to confront historical trauma and understand it in its historical context. For Indigenous people across the world, history is very important. They don't just live in the here and now. The past, the present, and future are all intertwined. And then when confronting and understanding trauma, you move towards releasing pain. And for this, she has developed a historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention, which she often combines with group interpersonal psychotherapy. In doing this, she has developed Native healing networks, the Takini Network, and they have worked together to assist Native Americans in terms of dealing with the historical trauma and reducing symptoms of their traumatic experiences. So highly applied research. Other Indigenous researchers have picked up the notion of historical trauma. For example, Andy Kealohi Sato Kunching, who has considered how historical trauma may in fact contribute to epigenetic modifications. So this is a critically important body of work for Indigenous peoples across the world. Now, these are just some examples of how across our psychologies, programmatic applied research might be conducted. But we need to move it, not just have programmatic research, we need to move it out of the labs and into the real world. So I'm going to give you an example here. Here I'm going to draw on my own research interest in terms of acculturation and intercultural relations. Starting off by quoting Valery Chirkov, 2009. Modern acculturation psychology has become almost useless for immigrant communities and for the immigrant assisting organizations. To the best of my knowledge, acculturation psychologists have been incapable of making their discoveries applicable to real life situations of cultural transitions. I'm going to add in a little historical flavor here about IACCP. The origins of this, which came from a special issue on critical acculturation psychology published in the International Journal of Intercultural Relations, its origins came from our 2000 IACCP Bremen conference, when Valerie and Dan Landis convened a session to discuss the crisis in acculturation psychology. Well, I think there's always room for improvement and more application here, but fundamentally, I disagreed with Valerie. I disagreed with him because I could see our own Center for Applied Cross-Cultural Research were doing research that was in the community and with organizations and having some practical value. But before I describe any of that, Chidam Kachichabasi and I both disagreed with Valerie, and to those ends, we edited a special issue of the International Journal of Intercultural Relations on acculturation theory and application, working with and for communities. In that issue, we had a range of papers from across the globe, included topics like services for asylum seekers in Guam, grassroots Moroccan women's organizations in Spain, participant action research both in the United States and New Zealand with refugees, community partnerships to do research on acculturation in immigrant families. So I'm convinced that there is applied acculturation research, and it can be very helpful. But if you're going to go into the real world, there are all kinds of ways that you can do it. The important part is we move beyond university students in our research, and that is true for all of psychology, not just acculturation psychology or cultural or cross-cultural psychology. Now, you can do this in different ways. You can have researcher-led research on one hand and partner-led research on the other. And in terms of researcher-led research, it can be as simple as working with community field assistants to help collect data, or working with organizations, ethnic organizations, to collect data. But you can take it further and have partnerships, real partnerships with organizations. So there's so much so that it involves co-design. And then moving more towards what might be partner-led research, you have the option of contract research. That's when your contractor or the person or organization that contracts you, they say, this is what we want. My experience has been, as you move from researcher-led to partner-led, you move from relatively more to relatively less theory-driven, but you also move from relatively less to more impact. So this is something to consider. If we look at just researcher-led, here's one example. We had a multicultural research team. This is about how normative multiculturalism relates to immigrant well-being. It was a sample of over 300 Korean, first-generation Korean immigrants in New Zealand. Our team included both Korean immigrants as well as international immigrants in New Zealand. We had community, the data was collected by Korean community field assistants who often work with organizations such as churches. This gives you a standard, mainstream, even please, weird universities out there publication in a respectable journal. This is where you have community assistance, but it's researcher-led. But you can move from this to co-design. And here's a piece of research that Jamie led with a couple of members of our Center of Applied Cross-Cultural Research in conjunction with the New Zealand Federation of Ethnic Councils, who wanted to know more about acculturation in immigrant families, and in particular, the dynamics between parents and their adolescent or young adult children, and wanted to know more about the acculturation gap. Was it there? Was it a problem? How it might be addressed? So the research team from our center, in conjunction with the New Zealand Federation of Ethnic Councils, applied to the Families Commission in New Zealand for research funding to address these issues, and we were successful. And then the organization recruited parents and children from immigrant groups across different national backgrounds, where the research team, particularly Jamie, went out, interviewed the families, the parents and children, again, resulting both in a publication where the then president of the New Zealand Federation of Ethnic Councils was a co-author, as well as a formal report to the Families Commission. So this is an example of co-design. And then you can have partner-led research, whether be it a community organization or be it government. They say, we want to know this. And in particular, needs analyses are conducted in this type of research. They go, we need to know what, for example, what are the needs of Muslim youth in New Zealand? Or an example of the research that we had done with the Multicultural New Zealand, a chapter of Multicultural New Zealand. They wanted to know about the needs and challenges of migrants and former refugees in their region. So this is less likely to be published, but in some ways it's a lot more likely to make impact. So for example, with respect to the needs report for immigrants and former refugees, we found that our report was used to take to the local regional council, who finally agreed to devote more money and resources to translation services to ensure better access to health and social services by migrants and refugees in their region. Okay, so talking about taking research into the community, the third arm of making a difference is grounding your research in theory. Now here you can adopt two approaches. You can analyze a particular problem or propose an evidence-based intervention in light of a theory that you particularly use or favor. And we see this all the time, and this is probably the more common approach. So for example, we might look at Stefan and Stefan's integrated threat theory, where they identify realistic and symbolic threat, intercultural anxiety, and negative stereotypes as factors that detract from positive intergroup relations. So if this is your theory of preference and you're looking to propose ways in which to enhance intergroup relations, you would be looking at how you might reduce threat. Or you might adopt Berry's multicultural hypothesis, which argues that when individuals feel secure in their place in society, they're better able to accept those who are different. So there you might be proposing multicultural policies which ensure both cultural maintenance and equitable participation. So we do have theories that will obviously address a lot of social problems. But there's another thing that you can do, which is you can start with the problem, and then you are being more theoretically eclectic. And I think this was characteristic of the approach I took very early on when I started to do research on cross-cultural transition and adaptation. And it seemed obvious to me very early on that there's a lot of adaptation. There are different elements of adaptation you need to consider if you want to achieve adaptation after cross-cultural transition. And this was at the root of my distinction between psychological and sociocultural adaptation. And in particular, the need to address psychological and emotional well-being, as well as the acquisition of the culture-specific skills that are required to thrive and survive in a new environment. To those ends, I suggested we look to stress and coping theory as a source for explaining the process of psychological adaptation, and that we look to cultural learning theory in terms of understanding sociocultural adaptation. So bringing in different theories to address a multidimensional problem. Problems are rarely very simple and straightforward. Another example I'd like to just use is not so much, well, it being theoretically eclectic, but being theoretically eclectic more in terms of generating an interpretive base for what data are telling you. And here's an example of a needs analysis that our center conducted. Again, this was for a regional group of multicultural New Zealand. So we did a one-day workshop with immigrants and former refugees. And at the end of the workshop, we generated a report. So this is totally data-led. This is what they told us their needs were. And we found that language and communication needs were really at the core of all of their other challenges, because without language proficiency and adequate communication, none of these other needs could really be adequately addressed. So there were needs for inclusion and connectedness, both with their family and members of their ethnic community, as well as New Zealanders more broadly. There were cultural needs, again, to acquire New Zealand cultural competence, but also to ensure maintenance of heritage culture. There were health and well-being needs, and then very practical needs, like needs that have to do with accessing the services that are required, and economic demands and employment needs. So these were a range of needs, but even this simple, apparently simple and straightforward information, you can cast in a theoretical light by drawing on various theories. So what we were able to do in our report is we were able to take acculturation theory, and in particular, Masgaret and Ward's book chapter on acculturation and cultural learning, where we position language proficiency and communication competence at the core of the acculturation experience when you're looking at it from a cultural learning perspective, that the language and communication competence underpins effective intercultural interactions, that the effective intercultural interactions in turn lead to better sociocultural adaptation, which again moves on to and facilitates psychological adaptation, health, and well-being. All of this going on while the migrants and former refugees are simultaneously dealing with the issue of cultural maintenance themselves. But these acculturation phenomena are occurring in a context. And here we add in Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to say we need to think about the service provision that is accessible to these migrants and former refugees. And that occurs in the wider macroeconomic environment. So we can use our theories, even if the research isn't theory driven, it's data driven, we can use our theories to help us interpret and understand what the data are in fact telling us. Right. So the final component is we need to communicate our research findings beyond our peers. And this can be challenging, and it can even, I think it can even be irritating. To do this, you need to be available. So you can be in the middle of doing some of your own work or enjoying writing up your journal article, and you get the phone call. And the phone call's from the newspaper or the magazine or some journalist across the globe asking you a question. And you think, really, do I want to be dealing with this now? But if you want to get your research out there, you do need to be available. Many universities, certainly including my own, have a find the expert track. So journalists or whoever who want to find out more about a certain topic can sort of have a look through the university web pages and find people who are expert on those topics. But you have to put yourself forward for this. You need to be able to translate your research findings into everyday language. This can also be really, really challenging. Many universities, again, including my own, are able to offer some training on science and the media. It may be of variable degrees of usefulness, but it is important for us to understand how to communicate with our target audience. This is one thing I have learned over the years, and I am still learning. It's like how to speak all of these different languages, the government language, the community language, the Joe Blogs on the street language. We have to learn many languages if we want to be able to communicate our findings to other people, be they people in the community or be they other professionals who don't have a background in psychology. Communicating with government, well, there are different ways this can be done. What we've found at our center is that it's easier, admittedly, it's easier in New Zealand. We have 5 million people. Our university is in Wellington, which is the national capital, and the ministries are just down the road. But what we find is that we get a lot of invitations to go and do on-site presentations of our research. We get invited to events that government organizes. So you learn to communicate with government. But using popular outlets is really a very effective way. Could be blogs. One of our fellows, Ron Fisher, was very good at blogging about important topics. Could be letters to the editor, could be social media, could be op-eds. And here I'd like to share with you, this is one that Jamie did after the Christchurch terrorist attacks. She wrote an op-ed for CNN about how hate came to my home. And in doing this, she cited a lot of research done at our center, done in New Zealand more widely, and international research, which would demonstrate how and why something as tragic and as unexpected as the Christchurch mosque attacks could occur. Here's something we've done at our center that, and you can do this in your lab. This is what we call our one-pagers. And essentially, we get our students to help us with this. We take research which is conventionally published. We have a standard template, which is here's the research, the publication source, here's the background, here's the research findings, and here's how it's relevant to New Zealand. And here's who you can contact for more information. These are just some of the ones we've done. You can do this in your own lab and put it up on your own website, or have hard copies that you distribute at various events. Students learn a lot. This is a technique that has in fact worked very well for us. So finally, just to give you 3 very quick, because I know my time is coming to an end, examples of real world applications: program development, public sector advice, and changing policies and practices. Making impact in the real world, program development and evaluation. Here, I'd like to talk about the Excel program. You may have heard of this. This is a program, Excellence in Cultural Experiential Learning and Leadership. It has been developed by Canadian-Australian team, Westwood, Ishiyama, Mack, and Barker. They have training programs based on acculturation theory and social learning, where they engage in alliance building, use development of cultural maps, have demonstration, feedback, coaching, and then the students set goals and take their new skills out into the real world. This program has been evaluated, and it's found that it leads to enhancement of social self-efficacy and improvement in social interactions, as well as better preparedness for cross-cultural communication. So develop a program. See you, Jamie. I see you. Develop a program, evaluate it. You can also lend your research findings to government, so it can be folded into public sector advice. Here we have our Ministry of Social Development generated a rapid evidence review. This was coming again out of the Christchurch terror attacks. They drew on research by academics across New Zealand. And this was used to inform the government's plans for increasing social cohesion. And finally, changing policy and practice. So this is the long game. You have to repeat your message again. You need to be able to link it to government priorities and terminology. And the example I wanted to give was, and I'm not suggesting this was only me, this was many academics across New Zealand who kept harping on the importance of cultural competence, not only for migrants developing competence, but also New Zealanders and service providers being able to deliver culturally competent services. So government developed a pilot scheme called Manaaki, which was building intercultural competence in the public service, which was rolled out across a number of government departments. And I was one of many members of the Expert Advisory Committee. And what we found is that this was actually selected as a highly innovative global integration project that was profiled at the OECD High-Level Policy Forum on Migration and Integration. So I leave you with this question, IACCP: can, should, and will we apply cross-cultural theory and research for social good? Thank you very much.